Typically, I'm a big fan of scares and spooky games, but there are some things even I'm terrified of, and worst of them all is the crash report screen on Vegas Pro. Ooh. I often have to work with multiple resources open to finish editing and compiling my videos, and browsers like Google Chrome put the hurt on my CPU and lead to even more crashes and lost progress, a real nightmare situation. Thankfully, I've switched to using Opera GX, the browser designed with gamers in mind. Not only does it help while editing, it's great for using while I'm streaming. With the CPU and RAM limiters, I'm able to control how much Opera GX usage impacts my PC, so I can have my game walkthrough or map open in one screen and my game in the other without worrying either will crash. And like any great game, Opera GX offers a host of mods, allowing for endless customization with just one click of a button. There's a lo-fi chill theme, a Game Boy theme, tons of themes based on popular video games, and of course, a great horror-themed mod that changes your browser sounds and visuals to a spooky theme. For folks like us who revel in the repulsive. And it's easy to switch to Opera GX. With the quick import tool, you can transfer all your information over from other browsers like Google Chrome, and you don't need to worry about tapping endless buttons or sudden QuickTime events. You can do it all with just one click. If only that were always the case. In addition, Opera GX is compatible with every single Google Chrome extension, so no need to worry about losing access to any of your extra gadgets or gear between browsers. It's completely free and definitely worth a look, if you aren't too scared. Click the link in the description to try Opera GX today, and you'll not only get to use an incredible gaming and horror-themed browser, you'll also be helping the channel out. Thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy. The late 2010s and early 2020s have been a time of incredible rebirth and creation for the horror game industry. From the remasters and reimaginings of classic titles to the brand new games from big budget studios and smaller indie creators, there are more incredible horror stories coming out of the games industry today than I can remember there ever being in my lifetime. For the first time in years, many of the classics are back and are soon to release together again, such as Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Fatal Frame. It's hard to imagine now, but back in the beginning of these games' lifetime, horror in games was hard, or at least it was going through a troubling growth spurt, where developers were having to reimagine how horror could exist in games. The 1990s were a transformative period for the games industry, the time when graphics were switching from old-school 2D to the new school of partial or full 3D environments. It was incredible. I remember those early years, young as I was, and I played the heck out of games like Spyro and Final Fantasy VII. These titles were considered revolutionary at the time, and people could not believe the kinds of worlds games could now make, each one adding to the depth and creativity that 3D could bring. But horror was having a bit of a problem adjusting. Games like Spyro have the benefit of using cute, simplistic designs for their characters. Final Fantasy VII also used chibi characters, and they moved across 2D backgrounds for the most part. These kinds of tricks made it easier for games to implement 3D, but horror games had it much harder. It's hard to be cute and be scary. Not impossible, but hard. Horror benefits from realism, from the sense you might be looking at something that could pop out of your own backyard, and graphics like Spyro's or Final Fantasy VII's just weren't going to cut it. Horror games in the 90s had a learning curve, and the developers behind them had to develop new techniques that would create something frightening and meaningful with limited capabilities. It would be the end of the 90s, and near the beginning of the PS2 era, that would finally see the full evolution of horror from 2D graphics to an entirely 3D environment. And it was Silent Hill that took that final step. Led by director Toyama Keiichiro, a young man directing his debut, Silent Hill would take the world by storm, selling 2 million copies early on and establishing a series that continues to this day. But it wasn't the first fully 3D horror game. In fact, the first came 5 years earlier, and it was just as revolutionary, perhaps more so than Silent Hill. Despite only releasing on a single console in Japan, the game garnered global attention, receiving reviews and commentaries from magazines across the globe. People knew they were looking at history. And so did Silent Hill's future director, as a young Toyama Keiichiro took notice when Dr. Hauzer first released on April 29, 1994. It was the true first fully 3D horror game, and Toyama realized the implications of what that meant. Toyama was a former film student, and his artistic leanings came from movies and television. He immediately thought of how full 3D could allow for the use of those techniques, moving camera angles, invoking a film-like atmosphere. He never forgot the feeling or the knowledge that sudden innovation awoke in him, that a horror video game could use the techniques of a film. Horror in games existed before the 90s, of course. There were 2D pixel games like Sweet Home and Laplace's Demon. There were video game adaptations of famous movies like Friday the 13th and The Evil Dead. And there were horror-adjacent titles like Castlevania. But what we really think of as horror in gaming truly started in the early 90s, when the evolution of game technology started to allow for more complex experiences. Games like Sweet Home can deal with horror themes. They can include fighting monsters and exploring a haunted mansion, but it's hard to consider them frightening in the same way a horror film of the time would be. The characters and the worlds are flat pixels with little detail, and when it stands next to something from even a few years later, it's not scary in the same way. That's why even developers from the era felt making scary games might just be impossible. Take Infogrames, a French game developer, and Frédéric Reynal, a young programmer who had an idea for a horror game as far back as the late 1980s. The company had acquired the rights to the Lovecraft mythos and were discussing how to adapt it into a game. One of the employees discussed using matches to explore an environment that was mostly cloaked in darkness. The idea struck Reynal, who was a huge horror movie fan, especially of more artsy directors like Dario Argento. He pitched a horror game to his boss at the time, but was turned down. It just couldn't be done, he was told. Behind the scenes, Reynal and fellow employee Didier Chanfray started working on a more detailed example of his idea, a proof of concept to show his boss it could be done. He knew the evolution of 3D technology had come incredibly far. With a few smart programming and graphical tricks, they could create the illusion of a real explorable world full of light and shadow. They spent almost 3 years working off hours on the game engine, and in September of 1991, they showed their boss what horror in 3D could really do. They got the green light, and in 1992, Alone in the Dark would debut to the world. It wasn't exactly full 3D, but it was partially 3D, and received great acclaim for taking that leap. For most, it's considered the first modern horror game, establishing many of its tropes and techniques and acting as a starting point for the study of the genre in the modern age. What the developers did was created a 3D polygonal model for their character, making a humanoid figure who could move and interact with the world. But said world was actually flat. Still images were placed on the background for the character to move around in, giving the illusion of a 3D world. It was the first time such a thing had been done in horror, and it would become a staple of many games of the era. But such a technique had limitations. Because the environment was flat, the camera could never move within a specific scene. Once the character left an area, a whole new image had to be loaded in, and the camera would fade to black and then fade in on a new scene. Said new environment could look incredibly different. It could be angled from a new direction, could be zoomed in or zoomed out, but the illusion of movement or change came from changing the image, not the camera placement. The camera had to remain fixed to keep the illusion working. In film, the movement and motion of the camera is the beating heart of the production. It is the eye, the lens into which we see the fictional world of the film. What it frames and what it doesn't says a lot about what the film is trying to convey, what is important and unimportant, and artistically it can convey an incredible amount of beauty and horror just from how a specific scene is framed. Games at this time just couldn't do it the same way films did. 2D art was fully flat. There was no camera movement besides moving up or down, left or right, which is incredibly limited. It wasn't nothing. Certainly many games did a lot with a little. But the limitations were clearly felt. The only way to have fully functional cameras in a game is to have a fully 3D world, to have an environment that was visible no matter what way you turn the camera. Unlike the fake, flat environments, there would be no illusion to break. The problem in this era always came down to size. The PlayStation couldn't handle rendering too much at once, and that was always what stood between a fully rendered world and a partial one. It was just too big. Alone in the Dark sacrificed 3D environments to make their world work, but the game would inspire the creation of a title that used full 3D in every scene. That was, of course, Dr. Hauzer, which released 2 years after the first Alone in the Dark. Riverhill Soft was a Japanese games developer primarily active in the 80s, known best for making games for home computers. Established in 1982, they were likely best known in Japan for a series of horror mystery adventures called J.B. Harold Murder Club. In the 90s, they shifted towards making console games. They made a few games for the Game Gear handheld system before shifting towards projects on the 3DO, the first of which would be Dr. Hauzer. Even on its surface, Dr. Hauzer has a lot in common with Alone in the Dark. The comparisons were made immediately when the game released. Dr. Hauzer also involves exploring a haunted mansion and solving a mystery. It includes finding items to open pathways, solving puzzles, and avoiding traps. It was obvious the team behind the game had seen and been inspired by the French title, but they took it a step further by making the game fully 3D. This is what stunned the world when the game first released. Despite being a 3DO exclusive, released only in Japan, writers and reviewers in the US and France were writing about it constantly. Whenever it appeared at game events in Japan, people talked about it, seemingly stunned at its existence. Alone in the Dark would be remembered as the beginning of horror, but Dr. Hauzer would be the first stepping stone towards a modern horror that was still evolving. Not only was Dr. Hauzer fully 3D, with environments that were fully texture mapped, it was also flexible in how you played it. Most screenshots show a third-person perspective where the camera looks over and moves with a player character, but it was also possible to play the game entirely in the first-person perspective. This was because of that incredible full 3D. There were no edges or flatness to hide, so any perspective could be safely seen. Of course, the game had to cut corners of its own. The draw rate for the graphics is quite low. Player movements aren't incredibly smooth or reactive, so it can be hard to control the character. There were no monsters or enemies to fight, but plenty of traps and sudden deaths to avoid, so being unable to properly control the character could itself create frustration and even fear. But the game allowed you to save your progress almost anywhere, which likely balanced out any anger a player might feel from being suddenly crushed by a rock or falling chandelier. If you examine the game's graphics, it becomes clear shadows primarily exist overhead to give a sense of depth, while the world itself doesn't seem to cast shadows. Likely, the developers chose not to use heavy shadows to save memory, and thus the 3D world manages to feel somewhat flat compared to later games. But for its time, it was a miraculous step forward. So the game made steps forward and stumbled a bit as it went. But it was just the start, not only for the industry, but for Riverhill as well. The small team that created Dr. Hauzer would go on to create another 3D horror game to greater success, Overblood, a 1996 PS1 game that would release outside Japan. It too would involve fully 3D backgrounds and a switching perspective between third and first person. Unlike its predecessor, the game would involve combat, as well as exploration and puzzle solving, and was set in a more sci-fi setting with genetic experimentations and cryogenics. Unfortunately, it too had a bit of a stumble. The combination of multiple genres and features led players to feel none of them were fully fleshed out. Complaints involved too much action that wasn't interesting, too long wandering empty hallways with no tension. The story and, at times, incredibly intricate puzzles were the best-liked features, and despite the mixed reviews, the game saw a sequel in 1998. Unfortunately, a disastrously poorly translated script and a very likely overworked director led the game to have even less appeal than the first, and the series came to an end. Of course, you can't talk about 3D horror and not mention Resident Evil, first released in 1996. While it was a step back in the sense the game was not fully 3D the way Dr. Hauzer was, Resident Evil managed a balancing act between technical prowess and entertainment, and it worked. The polygonal characters were far more realistic compared to Alone in the Dark from years before. They looked and moved like human beings, and the monsters that were being fought were incredibly detailed for the time. The environments were once again flat 2D backgrounds that changed as the player moved, which limited the camera. But the game used those still camera angles to great success by placing them in unique positions and difficult angles that increased the game's tension. Resident Evil learned from its predecessors. In horror, 3D was not everything. If you could create a full 3D world that was empty of fear, it was hardly horror at all. So we had two lineages in horror. The fully 3D that managed to create a world to explore, but struggled to make that world interesting or fun to play. And the mix of 2D and 3D that could create frightening experiences that were limited to specific angles and frameworks. How could you bring the two together in a coherent fashion and make something truly frightening? And so we come to 1999 and Silent Hill, the horror game of the era which is likely the best remembered, and certainly the most influential and revolutionary, because this is the game that did it. Silent Hill's team figured out how to balance fear and 3D. Dr. Hauzer had struck the director's inspiration years before. He saw that a 3D environment would allow for camera movement, and the thought had been percolating in his mind. The problem now was how to make that look good. Dr. Hauzer had also shown the PlayStation was incredibly restricted. If you rendered everything, it wouldn't look great, and you'd lose some of the atmosphere. As I've discussed in more detail in my documentary on the making of the game, the solution was genius and yet incredibly simple. Just don't show the whole world. In the mid-1990s, Toyama and his small team of a single artist and two programmers developed the initial engine and appearance of the world of horror adventure. It was director Toyama's idea to make the game fully 3D, but it was programmer Oshima Naoto's idea to use point lighting to create a realistic appearance in their 3D world. Create a flashlight that illuminates the immediate area, and then hide the distance with shadow, fog, and darkness. The PlayStation's low draw distance would work to their advantage. The player would feel isolated and frightened by how little they could see, while the 3D world around them hid in the dark. Toyama's dream of a horror game with film-like camera angles came to life. Moving through the shadows of their 3D world, the player watches as the camera moves in unique, artistic lines, not static and unchanging, only to fade in and out between new scenes, but alive. It could move in all directions. It could create terrifying, strange angles and frame the scene in incredibly unique ways. Here was the full evolution of early 3D horror, from flat backgrounds and static cameras to 3D worlds that were ugly yet functional, to a horrifying, unique 3D world full of secrets and shadows. This was such an enormous step forward. It was all the pieces coming together, artistic and creative elements that took inspiration from film, television, and popular storytelling, blending with technological achievements in a way that neither side suffered. Yet we can't forget these great achievements are made on the back of lesser stepping stones, that for all that it struggled to succeed, games like Dr. Hauzer are important for how they point the way forward. After all, we might never have gotten Silent Hill had a young Toyama Keiichiro not been so impressed with the brand new 3D world that Dr. Hauzer first showed him.